A couple of years ago, I got first exposed to the terminology creative research methods, and it was through meeting one of the British academics who are very much into this and has published quite a lot about it through her career. And I got excited because I like to see different ways of doing something. And in particular, our approach to research should not always be bounded by the old-fashioned notion of let's do a survey or let's do an interview, or let's just look at historical documents. I like the fact that there are new and I want to say crazy approaches, but different approaches to how we get information. And it amused me because I was listening to this academic talk about creative research methods, and I was thinking, this is old. I've seen this even back in my undergraduate years, because when I was doing my undergrad, and I did an undergrad in social and economic geography, when I was doing my undergrad, these were ideas that geographers and sociologists were playing around with. And I realized something. Actually, researchers have been being creative for quite some time. What they didn't do was give it a name. So don't have the idea that creative research methods is something new. Just have an understanding that it's stepping outside some of the traditional paradigms that we have, or the frameworks that we have for research, but also have the understanding that it is an evolving approach to how we look at conducting research and really gathering data. But it's an evolutionary approach, which we are still working on. So although nowadays it's lucky enough to be given a term, creative research methods, it's something that many researchers have been working with for quite a period of time, but also have been evolving and trying to codify or make more robust the methods. A couple of months ago, I think it was maybe 6 weeks ago, the third degree, Farrell and I and our university partners in Malaysia were visited by Professor Carol Elliott from St Andrews University in Scotland, and she ran a 2-day session on qualitative methods for us and for a number of academics in KL. And what was great out of that session is much of the work that she did, and we called it advanced qualitative methods, but much of the work that she did with our group of participants actually came down to some form of creative methods, taking an existing method, shaking it up a little bit, and looking how we can get more nuanced and, of course, more meaningful data out of that. And that was a great experience. I'm going to try and reflect on some of that with tonight's session as well. The objectives for tonight's discussion are to explore the opportunities for embracing creative research methods at postgraduate level. Now, some people will say, look, it's a very arts, social science thing. I've presented at a couple of keynotes where I've talked about the fact that creative research methods can be incredibly valuable within business research as well. What we have to understand is, look, creative research methods is a tool that we can use, and it is a valid and valuable tool at the doctoral level and even at the master's level for, when we go through later on and we start supervising students. Anything that is going to help us get a picture of what is happening in society, in organizations, in the world, and we can use creative research methods is very much acceptable at a postgraduate level, as well as further through in our research career. I want to understand what we mean by creative research methods. I've talked a little bit, but obviously there's going to be a lot more to come. Uh, but also how these have evolved in academic history. As I said, it's nothing new, but they have become more robust and more accepted over time. I want to explore different creative approaches to research, but recognizing that there's still many, 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 many more opportunities and approaches to explore. And that was something that was great about the session we did with Carol, because she introduced some new ways to think about existing creative methods. But really, what our job as a researcher becomes is how can we build on the methods that we are comfortable with and expand them in a way that helps us get data that we can then analyze and draw conclusions from to be able to disseminate our research. I want to understand the interplay between traditional research approaches and creative research methods because there is a starting point and there is a springboard point. And finally, the more important thing is I want to appreciate the ethical issues that we are going to encounter or we might encounter when embracing with creative research methods. Now, the purpose for tonight is not to teach you creative research methods, okay? If we have 50 hours, I can probably start scratching the surface. I certainly have a very good reference list of both ideas on how to go about embracing creative methods, but also examples of some very good research out there that has used creative methods in how they do it. And I will both share a very short list at the end of the presentation, but I will also put up on our website a reference list that will help you sort of guide you to a few different resources that are available. I think I also have the electronic copy of a couple, and if I do, I will share those through our WhatsApp group. Anyway, so as I said, I'm not here tonight to teach creative research methods, but really to open our eyes as to how we can embrace it both in and for our research. And I sort of separate out the in and for. In as a method to help elicit data that's going to give us conclusions. For as a way to further develop our understanding of how we can look at problems and come at problems with different viewpoints or different ways of trying to understand them, which I think is very important. So we have to ask ourselves, is the idea of research methods as a whole, are they creative or not? And, we sort of have this legacy, and most of us will be familiar with the legacy of, the qualitative quantitative divide. If you've come to my mixed methods session, I always end the mixed methods session by talking about the fact that there's no need to have the term mixed methods in the first place, because when research started, mixed methods was the norm and it was just called methods. And we then broke it up into qualitative and quantitative. And the truth is, even creative methods can be both qualitative and quantitative. Most of us, probably 99.9% of us, see the qualitative side, and that's legit. I think that's a very fair observation. The 0.1% of us that see the quantitative, and that is growing. Even myself, I see it. And I don't want to see quantitative stuff. But there is scope within quantitative frameworks and quantitative paradigms to actually have creative approaches. Now, the qualitative quantitative divide in research is kind of like the chicken and egg, which came first. I'm not, always that sure about it. But let's look at a few different things that have evolved over the last 300 years. In 1747, we had the first systematic clinical trial, so medicine-based, but it was a trial to see whether a particular treatment was going to work. And given the time frame, it was probably the use of cocaine with the common cold. But I'm not, don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure what that clinical trial was back then. The questionnaire, the concept of questionnaire or survey was only invented in 1838. That's not that long ago, but it became a method of trying to get information. Out of that, or out of the understanding that we can get information from people, research interviews only emerged in the very early 1900s. That's less than 125 years ago that a method that most of us take for granted today was actually used. Now, if we look at what creative research methods are, many of the creative methods have springboarded from research personal interviews. In the 1940s, less than 100 years ago, the focus group emerged as valid. Now, over time, we've had all these things come up. We take these for granted today. In 25 years' time, many people are going to take for granted creative research methods, and there's going to be whole new ideas, most likely based on the contribution that AI will make. But there are going to be whole new ideas as to how one can collect data. And while we call it creative today, tomorrow it's just going to become more method as standard. I want to touch upon Indigenous research methods for a moment, and there's a reason for this. On the weekend, last weekend, 2 weekends ago, sorry, I gave a keynote speech for a conference in interdisciplinary research, and I focused on the fact that Indigenous research methods are both a form of interdisciplinary research approach and also a form of creative research methods because they step outside of the norm, but they also allow us to cross boundaries that the more traditional qualitative quantitative paradigm from the previous slide actually has allowed us to do. Now, Indigenous research methodologies is grounded in an understanding of culture, not necessarily in an understanding of research. We as researchers have to adopt or have to adapt our approach to be able to fit in with cultural norms. But there is a creative element to this because we have to learn how to embrace and understand and take apart, deconstruct the stories and the narratives that we're being given so that we can then use this data to test against our hypotheses, to fit into or outside of our frameworks and so forth. So one of the enduring themes for this has been the concept of oral history. And oral history is considered a creative method. It's people talking, it's the folklore, it's the lineage, it's what has been passed down from generation to generation, but it's also what we are told today as the history of our forefathers. And that is creative in a unique way. It is holistic. It is very much relationship based. It is also considered ethical, and it is very much culturally embedded and culturally sensitive. Now, in terms of creativity, it's actually simply, it is different from an interview. It is different from a focus group. And given that we're dealing with historical fact historical interpretation, historical guesswork. It is also different to archival and documentary-based research, which has a paper record. So while some societies will have printed resources or printed records of everything that has supposedly happened in the history of that society, Indigenous research bases itself on the stories that our ancestors passed down and the lessons that we glean from those stories and how we use it. It also includes Indigenous knowledge. So why we use a certain plant to heal us in a certain circumstance and stuff like that. All of that becomes Indigenous research. It is becoming increasingly popular, both in the literature in terms of what's being cited, but it's also has a very strong traction as a movement on its own because we or many sorry, many researchers are saying, look, we need to decolonize research methodology. We need to take out that Western paradigm. And we need to be able to have a much more local community-based understanding in order to solve the problems that impact the communities that we are part of. So Indigenous methodologies is becoming much stronger, and there are some fantastic resources out there, fantastic books and articles that look at not only how to use this and when to use it, but how to integrate it with broader Western traditional, for us, traditional global South qualitative, quantitative paradigms. Now, I want to make a case for being creative. I think from an academic side, I'm going to break it up, academic and common sense. From an academic side, traditional research approaches, and what I mean by that is, what we're taught at university is introduction to qualitative research, introduction to quantitative research. These approaches don't always address the research question as adequately as we would desire. So ultimately, to be impactful or to have a point of difference, we need to be creative. And I'll give you an example. Let's assume we want to do some research that understands a kindergarten child's experience of the world and what is happening to them during their learning processes. Now, we can do observational research for this, but that is an adult's perspective on children's learning. How do we get that? That doesn't answer, or it doesn't give us enough depth. It gives us a perspective. If we were a Rubik's Cube, it will give us one side of the Rubik's Cube. We could do a survey. Imagine, trying to execute a survey with 12 4.5-year-olds. It would be utter chaos. But if we start being creative and we get them to draw things, or we get them to tell stories, or we get them to share in discussions and so forth, that actually becomes a lot more nuanced in its data, but it also gives us a different set of data, which we can then combine with or triangulate against observational data, surveys with parents, interviews with teachers, so many different things. Simply what it enables us to do is to answer questions in a more appropriate or contextualized way. Research is also inherently creative. We just put it into a box most of the time. But actually, the thing about being a researcher is we're a problem solver, and problem solving needs to be creative. It gives us an opportunity to advance our discipline, because most people think about the fact that our role as a researcher, whether it be PhD candidate, early career academic, all of that, our role as a researcher is to develop more knowledge. Half of that responsibility falls on us to say there are new ways to find and to understand that knowledge. That's actually really important. It's not just about understanding the topic, it's understanding the process that we get to learn about that as much as it is to understand the topic. And we are actually getting a situation where creative outputs, i.e., the dissertations that we are doing, are on the rise as well. So there's a few examples here. There's a gentleman in the United States who was looking at rap music and as a cultural phenomenon. And his dissertation was not a printed thesis like most of us here tonight will do. It was actually a rap album, a CD of written music, songs, and observations. And he actually defended his Viva in a performance-based style. In the South Pacific, just before, well, I think just very early on in the pandemic period, there was a researcher from the Pacific Islands, one of the Pacific nations, who produced her dissertation as a tapa cloth. And a tapa cloth is a traditional handmade, I guess the closest we would have is weaving, but it's not actually weaving, but it's a handmade storytelling visual. It's literally a giant painting, a giant blanket, whatever you want to call it. I'm not very good at describing it. But the entire research story was hand beaten or drawn into this tapa cloth and presented to the university as the research. Now, these might seem to be a little bit outlandish or outrageous compared to those of us who are doing 500 to 1,000-page dissertations. But the truth is, both were culturally appropriate. Both were also challenging the fact that there are many ways to communicate our research. And both were certainly being very creative on that. From a common sense perspective, why do we need to be creative? We want to support collaboration and connection. We want to spark fresh perspectives. And this is where researchers have failed. And if I go back, to the 1940s, there hasn't been a lot of new ideas come out since then. We need to bring fresh new perspectives on how we conduct research, not just the research we conduct. And it's also about empowering adoption and transformation, because as creative methods become more accepted as strong and credible approaches, and they're actually doing a good job with this at the moment, but as they become more and more accepted, we're actually able to really push the boundaries of the research that we're done or that we're doing. So what is or are creative methods? It's really just the name of an emerging field that seeks to develop new ways of understanding, situating, and reconfiguring knowledge. And they say in the telematic age. That's kind of because technology is really adding two things here. Creative methods engage participants outside the parameters of our traditional qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis. So they include empathetic, artistic, narrative, aesthetic expression. So I talked about the tapa cloth. Artistic, I talked about the rap music. For both investigating, intervening, and that's where perhaps the cultural elements are coming in, creating knowledge and sharing information. So they're intended to be able to give us or evoke from the research we're doing deeper research insights and certainly richer and more nuanced interpretations. The challenge here is you know, creative methods at this stage aren't necessarily generalizable. They're not something that we we interact with a group of kids and we've got the answer for every preschool across the world. But they are contextual and they are more meaningful than many of the other approaches. In creative research, we as the researcher can then include our own creative practice, which means the use of our imagination, the original ideas, creative methods and or output in the research as part of that. So it widens the opportunities that we might have in order to better understand the world that is around us. What do they embrace? It's new approaches, new ways, new ideas for thinking about solving old problems. It also embraces new data and collection. And because we're approaching research in a very different way, we're also getting very different types of data. Now, there's challenges on that because, if we do a survey or if we do an interview, we spend our time coding the data and we're doing it based on certain practices. As we're getting, say, visual or performance data coming through for us, that is actually a different set of analysis tools that we need to develop. So it's all great to say, yay, let's go and try and use, let's go and try and use a creative method. But we've also got to make sure we know how to work with or what to expect from the data, how to work with it, and have a program in line to be able to justify our interpretation and our use of that particular data as well. It's also a departure from tried and proven approaches, and I called them stale because honestly, the number of times we see, oh, researcher conducted a survey, woohoo. Researcher conducted interviews, woohoo. It's actually getting quite mundane, or it's getting quite boring. And when we are trying to look at finding something new and growing that body of knowledge, using the same old techniques doesn't actually encourage or inspire a lot of us. So, it gives us a chance to be fresh in our research. The biggest misconceptions that we get with creative research methods is creative is only qualitative. It's not. It's quantitative. It certainly uses big data. We have the fun that what we're learning about in using AI. And something that I saw last year, I went to a presentation about urban planning, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. And the intersection of creative methods, big data, and a general problem about urban design, they were overlapping massive data sets that brought in so many different facets of urban life and behavioral patterns of pedestrians and cars and all sorts of things. But what they were doing is this was quantitative data that had been collected. They were overlapping this in ways that most of us could not process with our current thinking about data understanding, but using AI to do this, we were actually getting some very creative outcomes. And the creativity came through linking different data sets that previously weren't seen as manageable from researchers. And the data that was coming out of it was fantastic. So the creativity was in how can you show relationships between different things that are there that the eye, or our brain capacity, um, was struggling to deal with on a very functional level. So it became creative. Another misconception, creative is only arts-based, i.e. draw a picture. Creative is new, it's old, it predates most of us who are here. Creative has no rigor. And a lot of academics who don't understand the concept of creative are like, oh, there's no valid understanding. But actually, what we are growing and doing, and what researchers have been able to do, is showcase that it is very valid, that it is replicable, and they can showcase that there is a step-by-step method to the notion of creativity within research. And when you can showcase that, and you can showcase its replicability, the ability to repeat the same type of research over and over again, actually you're justifying the value that it brings to the table. Some people will argue that creative is only for data gathering. No, it is very much purely, it is there for data gathering, believe me, but it's there to help give different voice. And sometimes it's going to give voice to those researched, or those people who are being researched, that may not normally have had their voice. So if I come back to my example of preschool, kindergarten students, they generally don't get a voice in the typical approaches to how we do research. The teachers do, the parents do, but the kids don't. Creative methods gives them that voice because they can express through communication that they understand, i.e. not necessarily through words or complex sentences or anything like that, but they can express things in other ways that give them a voice and give us, the adults in the room, um, another way of understanding what's happening within the context. And some people have called creative as being fringe, or worse still, experimental. Now, if we go back 25 years, maybe 30 years, mixed methods research was considered fringe and experimental, despite the fact that it's been around as long as anything else has as well. It's simply just becoming popular now, becoming popular again, but it is anything but fringe. It may be different because 95% of the world are doing standard qualitative and quantitative approaches, but it is actually becoming incredibly well accepted as a methodology. At the moment, indigenous methods, which I talked about, are also considered a little bit fringe, but they are gaining in respect and gaining in reputation as we structure, or we're able to record the structure of how we use it and actually systematize in a way that different methodologies can be repeated. Because in research, it's about you being able to, or another researcher being able to repeat the research, and get similar results. So it's all about that replication. So I want to go through really quickly the different types of creative methods, just to give you an overview of, what comes into it, or what comes into mind. And my challenge for you as I go through this is, look, you've probably already got your methodology well set, and that's fine. But you are going to have future research projects. And you may also come across problems in your current research project which you have to find new solutions for. So my challenge to you is to think about, is there a way that any of these creative methods or the structure of them, you might have to evolve them, of course, but is there a way that any of these creative methods could be used within your existing or future research? And if there is, what would they be? So that's my personal challenge to you at this moment. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 categories of creative methods. And I'm going to start off with art-based because this is the one that's most commonly known. And the focus is on an artistic process, so an artistic expression in all different forms as a way of being able to understand. And this includes things like visual, it includes performance. So, if I ask you performance, give a performance dance of your research, there are people who can do this. I won't mention an infamous Australian who failed at the Olympics, but she's an exact example of how that works. It can be narrative. Now, narrative can be uh, thesis, academic writing that we have. But narrative can also be stories. It can be, all those little stories that we tell ourselves, the anecdotes that we use that sort of align but don't align. It can be poetry. Um, though I'm not a fan of poetry, so I'd be a little bit scared of that. But it is valid. It can be the construction of something, it can be the deconstruction of something. And it can also be technological. So we might use technology to create something. So we use technology to create art, for example. We use technology to create music. We might also argue at this point, we use AI technology to help us develop some of what is going on in our research. And although AI is ethically indeterminate for the moment, we'll just say vague is probably the better word. There is going to be a place for it, and we need to understand how that will work. Using something like artistic processes is great for a number of reasons, for a number of, I want to say, experiences or audiences. So it's a subjective experience. It helps us with abstract concepts. It helps us with sensitive topics, both feelings and emotions. Maybe we cannot get the words out to describe what we need, but we can certainly draw pictures. Now, this is used, child psychologists use this with kids who are victims of abuse, kids who are victims of crime, but it's also a way that kids who don't have the language capabilities that we have can also express complicated ideas through visual or through performance that they couldn't do or would struggle to do through speaking. It's for working and researching with children. We don't even have to look at sensitive topics. To give children a voice, we're empowering them through techniques that they may be more comfortable with. For example, drawing. For example, the use of technology. That may be so much more powerful to them than us talking or them talking to us and not having the vocabulary to make that happen. It's fantastic for those who speak different languages. One of the challenges we face with cross-cultural research is needing to bring in interpreters and all of the issues that come with language issues. Arts-based creative research methods helps us to break down the communication barriers between cultures so that we can still get an understanding of what what is needed, what is important. Now, this is, for example, I've seen this and I've done this myself within environmental psychology, understanding uh, understanding our relationship with the world around us. And when we're dealing with people who have multiple languages, of which who, in my case, English was not their first language, they're still able to diagramize or pictorialize um, concepts. And there's been some great research with both adults and children that have used visual techniques to understand cross-cultural perception of the environment and environmental issues, for example. And this has been going on for 30 plus years. So it's a great tool for that. It's great when we have people with communication difficulties. I'm not talking about not speaking English or not speaking the language that the researcher speaks, but people who, due to health issues, for example, maybe stroke victims, as an example, do have communication difficulties and find that other approaches to sharing their voice, sharing their experience, actually gives them that particular voice. And it's also great if we're working with groups with mixed abilities. Now, imagine we want to do some community research. And our community research is understanding how small rural communities uh, are reacting to changes around them, for example. An arts-based approach means that everybody within that community is now able to contribute. And it's not about let's interview the adults and let the kids draw. Letting everybody take the same artistic expression approach actually levels the playing ground, because it's not about adults think differently for kids. They may not. They just may express it differently. It actually enables us to get a broader or stronger community feel through that. It should involve things like photos and drawings. And I'll come to that. I'll talk about that in a moment, because I had a great experience a few weeks ago. It can be diaries, it can be icons, emojis, it can be uses of artifacts, it can be maps, collages, bringing together from the environment, music, poetry, textiles, performances. So many different ways. So the other week when Professor Elliott was down, and she ran a workshop, 2-day workshop for us. One of the first things she asked us to do, and this was so we could actually, everybody could get to know each other. She asked us to take a photograph. And the photograph was, what does it mean to be a researcher in Malaysia? And then we were meant to share that photograph with someone else, and they were going to present it to the group. Fantastic experience, because it was just a new approach. My photography skill is crap, but I did manage to capture a photograph that I felt represented my feelings of being a researcher that's currently present in this particular country. Now, what was great about this is when you are being the researched, I had to take my own photograph. Everybody had to take their own photograph. We actually put significant time into thinking about the composition of the photograph and thinking about what we wanted that photograph to mean. Now, it wasn't a day in the life of, and just snap a photo of everywhere you went. This was a well-balanced, thought-out photo. And I think there are about 20, 25, 26 participants in the session. We all went out. I mean, most of us walked outside of the building and into the streets and all sorts of things. It all took at least half an hour for us to get a rudimentary photograph that we were reasonably comfortable with to be able to present back. Now, we had a time limit, we had a constraint, but if we're using photos or drawings and we're not giving that constraint of time, people will actually really think much harder about it. Now, when it came back, what it enabled was a very different perspective on our voice, because it's not just me saying, you know, I find it frustrating being a researcher in this country. The emotion and the imagery that that photograph showed, combined with the storytelling to the other person that who was going to present my photograph to the group, actually added to the voice and added to the narrative. And if you just interviewed me and you asked me, hey, what's it like being a researcher in Malaysia? I'd probably just say, you know, it's frustrating, there's some challenges, that's it. But when the photograph comes in, you've got all these visual things that somebody's asking you about and making you think about, and you're also thinking about it. The narrative got significantly more nuanced. It certainly had a lot more description or voice to it than if I had just been asked the question independently. The limitations of arts-based is, you know, sometimes it's uncomfortable to engage in creative activities. And I'll use again that as an example. I hate taking photographs, whether it's of other things or myself. If it's of other things, I usually rush the photograph and don't consider it very much. If it's of myself, I look down, because, you know, we use phones these days instead of other methods. I look down at the phone and I'm like, that's ugly. I don't like that. And it does take us out of our comfort zone. It also means we have a variation in artistic ability. If I was to ask you, draw something that is meaningful to you, I hate drawing. Well, it's not that I hate drawing. I love the freedom of drawing. I hate the output that I have because my drawings never look like what I hope they'll be. And I guess it's like imposter syndrome or something. I'm never going to feel comfortable with it. So everybody who participates is going to have a different level of skill. But I want to argue this. If we do a focus group, or we do interviews, or even we do surveys, everybody who participates is going to have a different level of ability of communication as well. They're going to be restrained by the amount of knowledge or experience. They're going to be restrained by their understanding of and use of language in a more formal setting. So there's always going to be some form of limitation. So it doesn't matter that it's you know, arts-based versus text-based, because I do believe that we face those same challenges. There is a limitation of the time commitment. You know, if I say to you, look, can you draw me your experience? And I ask you, can you do this within 2 hours? Some of us can't, or some of us won't have 2 hours to spare to work on this. So it is quite, you know, there are limitations in that. And the final one is the reproduction of common cultural conventions. So often when we're using arts-based methods within a homogeneous cultural group, we tend to get the same ubiquitous, generalized rather than unique imagery or perspective. But that's, again, something that we have to set up the method. We have to set up what we're asking our participants to do, we have to set it up in such a way that they can be themselves rather than they feel the need to be everybody else. We have technology-based creative research, and best called research using technology. Now we can have artificial intelligence, which is now what's taking over in this field. But the value of it is data collection. It is in faster, more accurate transcriptions of interviews and focus groups. It is in the mapping of the discussion within a focus group. So I've got down here software platforms and communication tools. So Harkness AI, for example, mapped focus group and discussion interactions. It told us who was talking with whom the most, what were the patterns of communication, what were the frequency of high-level vocabulary versus simple terminology, what was the tonality and the frequency of tonality of those discussions. All things that we try to observe in a focus group, but we kind of get lost in because we're focusing on what people say rather than the other clues that come with it. So, it helps with transcription, it helps with analysis. We can use technology-embedded arts-based research. But the platforms, the software and the platforms particularly, but also the communication tools, give us new ways to be able to handle ever-increasing data sets. Imagine transcribing 200 interviews. Transcribe them first, code them second, analyze that. That's a lot of time. Technology gives us a nudge, it gives us an edge, it helps us to do it that little bit faster. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be involved in that process, because you still need to understand it, you still need to reflect on it, and you still need to verify that the way in which the technology or the platform has approached it actually parallels how you feel. But it is incredibly valuable. So again, I've got a question for you. In your current research, what technology elements could you ethically incorporate into your research? Now, for me, it's the communication tools. It's also the platforms that help us to be able to work through and see new patterns or new trends that we might have missed from the recorded data that we have got. Now, this is creative because it's a new or an evolution to what we've got, but it's enabling us to see new ideas or new patterns or new behaviors that we as human researchers may have missed. Now, mixed or multi-methods, and it's, the exciting contortions of mixed methods. As I said, 30 years ago, mixed methods was considered new and fringe at the time. But at the end of the day, mixed methods helps us bring different things together. Now, rather than going through this whole slide, because I think you guys have all listened to me talking about mixed methods, or at least multi-methods, the question or the thing that I want to bring to your attention the most is we can embrace relatively standard qualitative, quantitative approaches or tools, but we can also bring into the fold a creative research methods approach to that. And if we're doing educational research, for example, this is extremely valuable. If we're doing social research, community-based social work, healthcare, this is going to be very valuable as well. It enables us to expand the age groups, perhaps. It enables us to look at problems from a fresh way. Let's talk about being transformative. And This is about research that wants to challenge, change, or impact perhaps a dominating position in society. Ultimately, research aimed to change a part of your participant's life. And by them being deeply involved with it at a level that they're comfortable, you're actually able to help bridge that gap and help make your research transformative for them. So we have participatory research, so involving those that we work with in the decision-making processes about both agenda, process, and action. So this will be things like peer-to-peer evaluation, self-reporting, autoethnography, or an ethnographic approach. We have action research, where the researcher and participants work together to diagnose an issue and a problem to be addressed, then implement the solution based on their understanding. So we're going to include tools like peer-to-peer evaluation, shadowing, diaries, journals, different ways that we can not only get the ideas, but also get their reaction, their reflection on those ideas too, so that we know whether it has been successful for them, we understand the challenges that we face, and so forth. And we also have community-based research. So that aims to explore community-based research questions. So unique to perhaps a geographical location or unique to a smaller community, rather than trying to solve the problem for the world, we'll try to solve the problem for one neighborhood. Only through understanding a community is it possible for you to know if the work you're doing for them is effective or not. And that's really important because you've got a very niche stakeholder group. It's niche in terms of who they are. There's also niche in terms of perhaps the numbers, the volume of them, the population that you're looking at. And this is going to involve, or potentially can involve, things like workshops, digital storytelling, photography, peer-to-peer interviewing, evaluation, and so forth. Anything that's transformative in nature that involves stakeholders, the more ways we have of A, getting their involvement, and B, getting their participation and feedback, so data, basically, both during and after, the better off we are to be able to help improve or enhance that particular feedback that there is. Creative research methods is about evolving traditional research practice. So it's the innovation on, or the evolution of, existing methods to be able to enhance and refine their effectiveness. So a few examples here are walking interviews. So we've been doing interviews for a very long time, at least, close to something like 100 years, if we remember correctly from the earlier slide. A walking interview is simply talking with somebody on the go. We're not putting them into an office. We're not putting them into a cafe. We're putting them into a different situation. We're also putting them into a situation where their level of focus is going to be different than if they're sitting down in a room having a formal discussion. So a walking interview is about making the person feel more comfortable. It is about getting them out in the environment. It is about getting them linking with their community and storytelling from the community that they are part of. Now, this is simply an evolution of interviews. It's the principles of an interview. We're just running it in a different way. So this is what I mean by, look, creative research methods is about taking existing methods typically and innovating on, or evolving from those particular methods. We can do enhanced focus groups and discussion groups. We can do WhatsApp videos. So during the pandemic, WhatsApp and other communication tools, so Telegram and Signal and Skype and Zoom, all became very valid channels to be able to conduct typical research with. We were able to do observational research through WhatsApp. So Grab, which is similar to Uber, they actually had all of their drivers record deliveries, record interactions with customers, because that was the only way they could get market research at the time. But what it did is it led the way of saying, you know what? We have all these technology-based tools, simple tools we use every day. We can make this part of our research process, and it worked effectively. We can do things like tablet or phone diaries. Great for kids, great for adults. Diarizing, keeping a diary is a fun research task. But for people involved, it's a break of habit and writing something down and reflecting. Whereas if we pick up our phone and we just sort of message ourselves a voice message about what we're feeling, actually it's less time consuming. It's easy to do, and it's exactly the same thing, except it's not writing. It's a voice note to ourselves, which as researchers we can transcribe, which as researchers we can analyze the tonality of it. We get so much out of that. And another one is movement trackers. You know, our phones, if we walk around with our phones, they're constantly tracking every single thing that we do. A movement tracker is really precise and able to help what's happening. Now, that's just an evolution on observational research in a way. There's a great meme I saw on Instagram a couple of days ago, and I should have included it here. But what it did is it attached to a number of packs of wolves in a forest. It attached a movement tracker and basically a GPS record of where they all went. And multiple packs of wolves, so like families of wolves. And the end results were fascinating because each pack had a different color ascribed to them. And it actually highlighted that each pack of wolves had a territory. And through the movement tracker, not only did you see what the territory was, you saw the peripheral interaction between them, but you also saw that they didn't cross over into each other's territory. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, I'm a business researcher, how does that matter? It's about what we get in terms of data, new ways of thinking about it. It's about if this has value for us. So, for example, maybe we're looking at processes, staff and processes within a factory setting. A movement tracker might actually help us to understand that, frequent communication between different parts of the factory is happening by people, but they're walking an extreme distance to do it, or they're doing it multiple times in a day, which suggests they need to either be closer or they need to have different methods of communication, or why are two processes within that factory happening at spaces that are so far apart when they should be, looking at new ways. So it could result in better factory designs. In the 80s, social geographers and retail geographers and economists were looking at shopping mall design and department store design. And you'll see through your own life how the design of shopping malls has evolved over the years, because it's about the movement of people between different parts of the mall, between different shops or between different levels and all of that. Movement trackers are responsible for evolving how we understand these particular patterns as they progress. Okay, let's I'm sort of going to wrap up in a few minutes. Let's just go into situating ourselves. And this is the role, I guess, the role of us, or the role of intuition in creative methods. And I'm going to argue, look, intuition plays an important role in our development as researchers. I always talk about the need to have intuition. Do you think it's working? Do you think it's not? Do you think the data is wrong? Do you think it can be better? In terms of intuition and creative research methods, we use it to help processes. You know, we have to think about, is this the logical way? Are we giving the right instructions? Are we approaching it in a way that's too cumbersome or maybe too simple? Maybe we're getting simple data. It's like, I have to re-explain this because I'm not getting the type of data I want. But intuition gives us that. Intuition tells us about dangers. You know, we're going to get some things that aren't going to work out. My argument, I guess, my advice always is use your intuition because you know yourself better. And if you think it doesn't come across right, I would argue that you probably are right. So, you know, keep that intuition there. It helps us think about the limitations. It helps us think about how we can expand and extend. And this is our observation of the creative research methods, process, and engagement with respondents. The more we observe and we see, the more we are able to think about, how can I refine this? How can I expand this a little bit? How can I tweak it here and there to make the entire experience more meaningful, but also to strengthen the reliability of the method itself? We use it to think about the scope. You know, if I ask you, please go and work with 500 primary school children aged 10 years old and get each of these children to keep a visual diary daily for a 6-month period. That's way too much work. My intuition's already telling me this is crazy. I can't process that amount of information within that period of time. So it is very important to be able to think about what is realistic as we go about this, because creative methods bring us new forms of data. The new forms of data take us longer to analyze, to process, sometimes even longer to understand. So we also have to be cautious about that. So thinking about the scope. And finally, it's important in terms of opportunity, because again, we can see what can we do with this? Now, I'll come back to that conference I went to last year, where they overlap massive, multiple quantitative-based data sets, and were able to see entirely new patterns, things that they hadn't thought about. So the opportunities are, how can we link some things that we might not have originally thought about, but how do they link into our research? Because they're coming through as a theme in what those being researched are providing us with data. Now, before I wrap up, I want to talk about ethics and ethics in creative research methods. The same ethical standards, of course, apply. And ethics is always going to be a negotiation. You know, sometimes we get away with things, sometimes we have to take shortcuts, all of this. You're going to have the same challenges and questions posed at you, and you've got to be able to answer that. If we were doing research on sexual abuse of young children, an ethics committee is more likely to approve a creative method in order to get the child to share than they would approve of an interview with the child or with the child and their parents simultaneously. So it's a negotiation. Sometimes a creative method will allow us to get in there and get some information that typical or traditional methods might be seen as too harmful for a particular respondent or group of respondents. We have to worry about informed consent. You know, no matter what, we still want informed consent. We want that voluntary participation. We should be aiming for no harm or non-harm, which includes long-term embarrassment. So if we're asking people to photograph themselves and then we're publishing it, we've also got to be sure that that photograph isn't going to be compromising or embarrassing for them into the future. You know, all of our parents who took photos of us growing up in stupid costumes and stuff, and when we hit 21 or whatever, and they show the world these photos, that's embarrassing. We've got to avoid that. But we've also got to juggle, we need this information versus we don't need this information as well. A great thing about creative research methods is the stronger possibility of anonymity, not being able to identify the respondent. But if we're doing photographic methods, for example, then there's a stronger possibility of identification of that individual, because their image may be in the photograph which we want to publish. So we have to look at how does the identification slash anonymity scenario change based on the creative method that we are using. We have to consider plagiarism and honesty, so technology related research and how whether that comes into it. The image capture of others, so it's not about me photographing myself, it's as I'm photographing a day, for example, looking at my interactions in the neighborhood, photographing others who are non-participants and not being able to get informed consent by them. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to cope with that in our research, in our dissertation? And finally, we have to deal with copyright issues, because imagine I ask a group of, preschool kids to draw a picture of their experience of school. In legal terms, they own the copyright to that image. And if we use it in our research, we've got to make sure that we actually have the rights to use assigned to that. And the rights to use have to be not only for our dissertation and any presentation that we do at university related to that. It's also if we choose to publish it in a journal that we can publish that particular example as well. So it creates a different set of issues. If we video somebody in a public space, the copyright's ours, it's our material. It's open access, public space, so we can use it in any form in most countries that we like. The moment somebody contributes to that as a content creator, whether it be visual or via graphic or whatever, and they're knowingly contributing, they actually have copyright claim, which is different from ours. So we have to be very cognizant of what those issues might mean for us. This is a few examples of references, as I said before, but I'll put this up tomorrow, and I'm going to put on the website an interesting set of references that I think are very valuable for you. There's a new one, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Creative Research Methods, which actually just came out a few months ago, that looks really good. But there's a lot of stuff out there at the moment that's very easy to access, that explores in depth how we can, for different disciplines, how we can embrace different creative research methods.